Something to Chew On is a podcast devoted to the exploration and discussion of global food systems. It's produced by the Office of Research Development at Kansas State University. I'm Jay Weeks, PhD candidate in the Department of Agronomy. My co-host is Scott Zanona, an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy who specializes in the philosophy of science.
Do you ever wonder sometimes why you do the things that you do? Or why, when there seems to be an obvious, rational route to a specific goal, some people repeatedly undermine their own desires and best intentions? The current scientific literature on decision-making is extensive and far from complete, but what is becoming increasingly apparent is that, in some ways, we may be in less direct control than we might want to believe. Our guest today is Dr. Kim Kirkpatrick. Kim is a University Distinguished Professor of Psychological Sciences here at K-State, where she is the director at the Cognitive and Neurobiological Approaches to Plasticity Center and leads research at the Reward, Timing, and Decision Lab. The main focus of her research is the role of timing and reward processes in determining impulsive and risky choice in rats. This was a really interesting conversation where we discussed the role of diet, specifically those high in certain types of fats or sugars, and promoting impulsive behavior that may be linked to obesity. There were all kinds of implications for this type of work on our personal lives, as well as governmental policy, and we try to dig into all of that. Definitely, it was a fascinating topic that I'm sure many of you will enjoy, so we now bring you Dr. Kim Kirkpatrick. Dr. Kim Kirkpatrick, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you. It's good to be with you.
So I've been, pretty excited to have this conversation. I've been looking forward to it ever since we got into contact. And before we get into what your lab does and your research and all of that, we usually like to get a little bit of background information. So if you wouldn't mind, would you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm professor in the Department of Psychological Sciences. I also direct a Center of Biomedical Research Excellence over there called the CNAP Center. And I've been at K-State since 2008. Before that, I actually taught and did research for 8 years at the University of York in the UK. And then going back a little bit further, I did my graduate training at the University of Iowa and my postdoctoral training at Brown University.
So what got you into psychology?
I actually started off, I was at Iowa State University, and I went there for engineering, and I took a general psychology course, and it was taught by a neuroscientist, and it just lit me up. I loved it, and I changed my major, almost right away.
Yeah. Was it illuminating to see, explanations for things going on around you, why people behave the way they do, or what?
Well, and it was really the brain, which is it just seems so fascinating and so much that we didn't know about it. It just sort of seemed like this frontier that I just wanted to get into, know.
How would you say the field's changed since then to now?
Well, we know a whole lot more, so I think that's good. And I hope I have made my own little bit of contribution there. I think that there's a lot more public awareness of neuroscience now, maybe helped a little by Big Bang Theory. And then brain health, I think, has really become a really big issue. I think this understanding that we need to not just look after things like our heart, but we need to also really think about the aging of our brain. That's something that's very near and dear to me for our research program, is to think about brain health and how things that we eat and do kind of affect our brains.
We have more information, certainly. Is the general overall quality or veracity of that information higher or lower? We seem to get a lot of population of social media sites with information that's potentially spurious.
Yeah, I think that, I'm sure you guys are aware of the Replication Crisis. I think that has shown a spotlight on some issues with all sciences. And I think there are some things that came out of that have made people aware that we really need to think about the robustness of our methods. I think neuroscience certainly has advanced to having much more elegant techniques that allow us to get at functioning of specific cell types and networks. And in that sense, I think it's been very good. But oftentimes, as we start to really drill down and become more specific, we also begin to lose some of the power to really detect effects. And so I think there's always a trade-off between specificity versus whether you can really get the the power of you need. I mean, because if you're getting really specific, you might now get down to where you're dealing with 5 neurons, and then are you going to really be able to figure out what those 5 neurons do?
Yeah, N of 5.
Yeah.
For the listeners who don't know, what is the replication crisis, and why is that important?
So it refers to the fact that some of the results that have been reported, even ones that are like in textbooks, haven't really bore up to being able to be replicated when others went and tried to do the research very similarly to how it was originally done. And I think what really kind of came out of it was this recognition that some of it's because of the way we do our statistics and too much of a focus on p-values and trying to just get over a certain line, and not enough of a focus on effect sizes. And it turns out a lot of these things that don't replicate very well are really small effects, and so they're just probably spurious. And
Just something to do with the group that was.
it could be
tested,
just something
right?
with the group that was tested, or maybe.
Or they're presuming something is a replication when in fact it's not a replication. It's not a true statistical replicant.
Sure.
So.
Well, and this is hit just for everybody, for people who are listening, it's hit not just psychology and social sciences, right? There's a lot of other areas, a lot of medicine, cancer research.
Right.
all over.
Sort of
Pharmacology
hit,
was a really big one.
Yeah.
Drug development research was a huge one. I think that one thing it's really kind of shown us is that you do really need to have robust designs. You need to have good sample sizes. And also it turns out that within subjects research is much more replicable. So if you look at an individual's behavior relative to their own baseline performance, that's much more replicable than if you're looking at comparing two individuals.
Good. And so some of the responses to this, I mean, so there's been these increased efforts to do more replication, and the incentive structures for scientists to do these are not great, right? So this is a hard thing. We don't actually do a lot of just like, let's try to do exactly the same thing, right? But some of the response to this has been that look, we've got some things about our statistics that we need to worry about, but some of it is just about the transferability, right, from one area to another, right? So you do a study on a group of undergraduate students at your institution, and then you say there's this general phenomenon, right? But it doesn't necessarily apply somewhere else because like people are so complex, right? So just, I don't want to push you too much on this stuff, but what's your main thought? I mean, how much of this is like the things didn't replicate because, as John just said, they were actually looking at like a different population, or there was something different going on, and how much of it was things didn't replicate because we were looking at such a small little effect that maybe we thought we found something that wasn't there.
I think there probably are some of that too. Like all effects have boundary conditions.
Yes, right.
And that can affect replication if people go outside of those boundary conditions. One thing we do a lot in my research program is we build in nested replication to a lot of our designs, so that way if we get a result that seems like funny, like not what we expected, we can at least look at the nested replication conditions.
So nested replication, could you explain that?
Nested replication is where you maybe have like one or two of the conditions within your study that are things that you already have done before. And so it actually like provides a way to connect together. Like if you do 2 experiments and the second one, you now include at least like one condition from the previous experiment. And then there's actually statistics you can use. It's a kind of Bayesian statistics where you can use the first experiment as priors for the second one. And you can actually do tests on like, how likely it is that effect is then going to replicate if you do it again and again. And so I think that's one really good way forward. Whenever I kind of write my grant proposals and I have to talk about robustness or replicability, I really call upon nested replication as a real strength.
So what kind of work is your lab doing?
Yeah, so I mean, we're really interested in impulsivity, which is when you aren't really able to wait in order to maybe get a better outcome. So we specifically study, I don't know if you guys know the marshmallow test.
Yes.
Yeah,
Sort of
it's very well
yeah.
known. But
Yeah, why don't you explain it? Yeah.
We study decisions kind of like the marshmallow test where, this was done in kids where they kind of had a choice between you could get 1 marshmallow now or you could wait 15 minutes and then you can have 2. And of course, some of the kids could wait and some didn't do so well. But what made it so famous, and is why even philosophers know about the marshmallow test, right, is that when they went back and looked at these 4-year-old kids when they were teenagers, they actually found that the kids who could wait had higher SAT scores. They actually were performing better on a lot of metrics of their like social, abilities and their, abilities to like deal with, challenges and things of that sort. And then really funny enough, they actually went back and looked at these kids when they were in their 30s. And they actually found that the kids who waited for the 2 marshmallows had lower BMI. And that's kind of interesting when you think the kids who waited for the 2 marshmallows actually are thinner later.
Yeah.
Right.
And what that tells us is it's not really about the marshmallows, but it's about the self-control that you need to be able to wait for the marshmallows.
Right,
So, I mean, I think this is really fascinating. So it's made it so famous that this test you do just one time with a kid when they're 4 actually predicts all of these things like later in life, even well into adulthood.
That's interesting because that crosses metabolic changes. It crosses brain development stages.
Yeah, and all different kinds of like SES and lifestyle and just, all different kinds of things that, right? And this does look to be a well-replicated effect.
So did you get interested in this early on in your psychology career, or is this something you came to after some period of time?
I kind of migrated there, but my research program, just as it does, you tend to kind of build and progress. And then I would also say that a lot of my research is student driven. And so one of my students was actually the first person who kind of started doing impulsivity research in my lab. And she found some really exciting things, and we just kind of built from there. We kind of continued doing it. But I always love to let my students take me interesting places.
Interesting. And how do you decide which ones not which student, but which research project gets to move forward? Are these undergraduate students or graduate
students? This was actually a PhD student.
Okay.
So it was her dissertation that really
Forget
kind of
that question then.
Right. Where we're going. Yeah. We do have undergrads that kind of do some interesting things too, though.
So how are you testing impulsivity? Is this more marshmallow tests or what's going on?
Well, we have some work. Most of our work is in rats, but we do also do some work in people. So in our rats, what we do is they're actually in a special box where we can give them these levers that they can press. And we have these little food magazines, they're called, that actually let us deliver automatically with a computer different numbers of food pellets. These aren't nearly as tasty as marshmallows. Not that I go around like tasting them.
Tasting rat food,
But so the rat can choose, like, does it want to get one food pellet, and it maybe has to wait 5 seconds. Or it could wait for, say, 20 seconds and it could get 2. And so it's the same kind of question, right? It's just asked in a different way. Now, of course, the rats don't really know what those contingencies are. They have to learn them through pressing and getting things. And we also don't just ask them once. We ask them hundreds of times, and we can change the amounts and change the delays. And then in people, we're actually doing something that's very similar to what we do in the rats. We have actually a food dispenser, very much like the rats. It dispenses mini M&Ms, and people get a question on the computer screen. It literally says, like, 1 M&M in 5 seconds or 2 M&Ms in 20 seconds. And then they pick, and then they have to wait, and then the M&Ms come out, and yeah.
Fascinating.
So, and their behavior actually looks very similar between the humans and the rats.
Is there an assumption that everybody's going to want more food or more M&Ms, or is there, what's the utility function here over?
So we've actually found something really interesting in that regard, because some people just want more.
And some just want just one, right?
Some just,
no?
And some just want a red
like
one.
some people pick the 5, and it doesn't matter. No matter what, they'll always pick like the 5, which is the biggest one we offer. But we actually found that people, we've done some work looking at how diet, kind of predicts what people do on this task. And we found that individuals who eat very low sugar diets actually really only wanted the small choice M&M no matter what. So I thought that was interesting. Maybe reflects them like kind of having such a really high level of self-control, or possibly just that they've developed a preference where it's like, I just don't eat much sugar, so I'm not going to want to have a lot of M&Ms.
Yeah, because we want to find out what you're doing with all this. But I think one of the basic questions here about sort of if you're measuring impulsivity, right, it's kind of an assumption that like, oh, if you wait for more, that makes more sense, right? That you've got more self-control in that sense, right? But yeah, there's a lot of factors which you control for, right? By looking to sort of see what their other interests are. Yeah.
And I thought it was really interesting that people on the low sugar diet, I mean, they're actually exhibiting self-control, but they're doing it in a different way from what we think about with the marshmallow kids. They're not really necessarily doing it by being willing to wait for maybe a longer term outcome of like, I'm going to fit into that dress on Saturday, right? Rather, what they're doing is they're regulating their amount preference. They're saying, I'm just going to prefer to eat really small amounts of that food type.
You could probably test the same thing in terms of salt for people that were on low salt diets to see if it had the same effect.
Yeah. So I really want to dig deeper because we just found this in a study we did pretty recently. I would like to dig deeper and try to understand some of these strategies that people engage in. Because I think self-control is certainly one that we know is really important, but there may be other, maybe even some decision biases that people develop, or heuristics that people develop, where that just allows them to just almost be automatic in those decisions, where they just say, I always just pick the small one or something like that.
You might explain what you meant by heuristics.
Oh, yes. So a heuristic is really just kind of like a rule that you can use that helps you be able to make decisions more or less automatically. You don't really have to think too much about them. You just do it without thinking. And that can be really beneficial if people can establish those, if they're wanting to change their health, because then they're just doing those behaviors automatically, almost habitually, rather than having to actively work at them.
And is it true that actually sort of a lot of how we live our life is really just like this? We kind of develop these rules and we kind of tend to just follow them, right? We're not every day processing each decision we make, right? In a way where we go all right, which is going to be better for me, right? Yeah.
Yeah, there's actually, so I don't know if you've heard of Daniel Kahneman. So he's got the system 1 versus system 2. And the system 1 are these biases, heuristics, and just automatic processes. They guide the majority of our behavior. But then we do have the ability to engage those more complex systems. But people are actually very lazy cognitively. They actually would much prefer to engage system 1 and only use system 2 when you're really forced to it.
Right. And it's not like that's a decision either, right? So that's just kind of what happens, right?
It just happens. And I mean, I think it's because system 2 is really it's labor intensive. It actually uses a lot of brain fuel, if you will, to engage system 2.
So are these actually different physical systems, or are they kind of, how do you think about these as when you say system?
Well, I think there are bound to be different brain networks, although I'm sure there's overlap. But I think the thinking of it as a system is more a way to just distinguish that,
a set of psychological processes
you get
or something like that.
A set of processes, yeah.
And when you say there's biases in system 1, this is because they're automatic and they work well for a lot of circumstances, but under other circumstances they send us the wrong way, right? Is there some standard examples of those?
Yeah, well, even just the example I was going back to my low sugar people, a choose small bias maybe is really helping them with their dieting, but it maybe wouldn't work so great if they're making decisions about money.
Right. Right? Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So some of the work you're doing in your lab is looking at what dictates who has these biases and things, right? And whether or not you're genetically born with it, or whether or not it's your diet that's affecting this, and so what's going on there?
Yeah, so we are looking at those factors, and we are also interested in whether we can change decision making. So we're really interested in dietary factors. That's one of the big areas we look at. We do also look at individual differences to try to look at what kinds of variables might just predict how people are going to choose in different situations. And then we are also developing interventions. My current NIH grant is actually all about developing these interventions where we're trying to train self-control. We've actually gotten a great success with this with our rats, and we are currently working on trying to translate it with our humans. I think one advantage we have with the rats is that they live with us. And so we can just, really train them, and they become really happily self-controlled, not over self-controlled, but at a happy level of self-control. And it does seem to provide then some resistance to problem behaviors that emerge from impulsivity. But we haven't quite got it working in people yet.
So how does it work in rats? What do you do to train them?
We actually give them experience where they have to just work at learning the delays that they experience in the task. So we might just give them 10 days where they just get the 20-second delay that they'll later have to choose about.
So they have no choice there. Is that?
But they don't have a choice.
Right, okay.
So it's forced exposure
they just get used
to the
to it.
kind of delays that they're going to later have to make choices about. I think one thing that happens is they really learn the delay. Like they learn them better than they do when they're in the choice environment.
I was going to ask you whether or not there are differences in populations for time length discrimination.
Yes, that's actually one of the variables we look at. We found that poor time discrimination is a predictor of impulsivity. And that's true in people, it's true in our rats, and actually ADHD is associated.
That's where I was headed.
It's associated with poor time discrimination and heightened impulsivity. Yeah, so that's one of the factors we look at. And we think their time discrimination does get better when we give them this training. And then we also think that they just learn how to wait better. And so we have that factor as well. But we have been very successful in training the self-control through that means.
Are there dietary factors and things that control the ability to maintain self-control? So, not every person is able to have discipline, right? Or to the same degree. What are some of the factors that might impact that?
We've looked at high processed fat, I should say, so Crisco, and high sugar diets in our rats. One thing that's very nice in rats is that you can control their dietary history. So we can really say that it is really the diet, because oftentimes diet actually is confounded with a lot of other things in people. But
meaning it's associated with all kinds of other things that might also be. It is
like low
playing
SES and even just like where you live.
They're also notable liars if they're
people aren't good at reporting their diets even when they mean to, and then plenty of people try to hide what they eat. But in our rats we can actually control this experimentally, and we found that both high fat and high sugar diets, if they get a few weeks of exposure to them, make them more impulsive. And then we found so they were on the diet for several weeks, and then when we remove them and give them some time to just get back to normal, their weights drop back down to normal, and then we retested them, we actually found that in a subset of the high fat rats, they actually still remained impulsive. But the remaining high fat rats and the high sugar exposed rats actually recovered and looked normal. So we think that fats particularly seem to be producing major, pervasive and probably long-lasting changes
in the brain that make you more impulsive.
Yeah,
or at least for the rats. Yeah.
So and fats are very inflammatory. So these processed fats that I'm referring to. So we think there's probably neuroinflammation that's causing damage, and that's long-lasting.
It's what's the difference when you're talking about processed fats? So you haven't tested other things, but do you have a hypothesis about what's the difference between the processed fats? Why they're more inflammatory, right, and might be affecting the brain more than other fats would?
Yeah, it seems that the processed fats. I'm not a chemist,
sure, right?
So I can't tell you exactly what the reactions are, but they actually damage the blood-brain barrier, which is the barrier that kind of keeps things out of the brain that are designed not to hurt our brains, and then that allows it become more porous, and then it means that the fats themselves can get through, as well as a lot of other things that can then lead to inflammatory processes.
Wow. And so what's in the category of processed fats? So Crisco, you said, but what other things if I don't know anything about fats?
Yeah, so it would be really any, for example, your hydrogenated vegetable oil would be another example. So anything that's really being, processed through, it's not like a natural fat, like butter would be a natural fat, but anything that's being kind of processed to change its constitution. And then saturated fat, I think, is a really key element too.
So does this create sort of a vicious cycle of impulsivity then? If you're on a poor diet and then you aren't able to control yourself and you eat a further poor diet, so you just kind of spiral down the hole then?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what happens. And we've actually been able to really kind of chart that in our rats and see that vicious cycle development happen. So, and I think if you kind of think about people who are living in what are called obesogenic environments. I don't know if you've kind of come across that term, but they're environments that really promote obesity because there's a lot of fatty foods, lots of McDonald's and other kinds of fast food restaurants in the area. That would be a really big problem when you think about it, because people are probably more likely to eat those foods because they're readily available and cheap. And then as they eat those foods, it's going to undermine their self-control, and it means that they can't just drive past those restaurants anymore. They're going to be tempted to want to go in.
Is there any indication that this affects children or adults more so or less so? So if a child has a high-fat diet early on, does that promote this behavior more as an adult?
I think that in terms of the brain health effects, almost certainly are going to be worse in a developing brain, because you could actually alter the trajectory of development if you're producing neuroinflammation during that time. And so I would expect that with children, if you are producing this kind of high level neural inflammation, you would really see different developmental trajectory in the brain, and probably much more likely to have persistent long-term effects.
So it also suggests that perhaps parents or other professionals are really taking the wrong approach when they're trying to deal with young, obese individuals to try to get them to change their behavior. If they're doing things that are still allowing a diet that's allowing more impulsivity.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think changing the diet is probably the first step, and then maybe some self-control training would be another really good thing. We've actually started doing a little bit of work with Healthy Hawks, which is at the University of Kansas. They're a childhood obesity treatment program. And one of the things that they found is that impulsivity is actually a big predictor of dropout from the program, and also from like failure to go along with the exercise and the dietary requirements, which you would not surprising, right? So we're kind of working to see if we can develop our interventions we've done in our rats into an app that the kids could maybe use to practice their self-control. I think maybe we could do some scaffolding where we could get their self-control maybe looking a little better, then they might be able to stick with the diet and the exercise and might be able to stick with the program.
So I wanted to follow up earlier about that, but so you talked about training the rats, right? Mm-hmm. Not as much success in humans yet, but you don't have as much control. What have you been doing? What have you seen for training people to be less impulsive?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it's very early stages, but there is there's a little bit of literature in kids. It's a little bit older actually, but where individuals did this kind of delay exposure training.
The same sort of thing.
The same sort of thing. And they found, at least in the short run, they were able to get improvements in self-control. In our rats, we've actually found that our intervention effects lasted when we retested them 9 months later, which is, I think, around 15 human years.
Wow.
I think. So we actually have a technique that's not just strong in terms of its effect size, but also really long lasting.
What are those interventions? Sorry.
Where we just give them the forced exposure to the delays repeatedly, okay. And then later give them choices between the delays that they got exposed to.
So what would this look like in humans? Is this the sort of thing like, right, oh, I'm hungry right now, let me like set up my lunch but put it off to the side for a little bit before I eat it, or like things just like spend a bunch of time just doing that kind of thing? Or
well, we actually, with the Healthy Hawks, we're developing a game that the kids play. It's a kind of Space Invaders like game, but what they have to do is like they press a button to fire a shot at the ship, but then they have to wait a certain amount of time before their missile recharges and they can fire again. And we don't tell them how much they have to wait. So they have to, just like at rats, like experience the delay and really learn about it and kind of practice it. And we really like to maybe get it so that they could play it on their phone. And then we've also thought a little bit too about just having in adults, I think would be probably more likely to work. But there's another kind of training that you can do. It's called mindfulness training. And it's where you kind of really practice like paying attention to certain kinds of cues. And we're thinking that some mindfulness training for really paying attention to delays could maybe be a nice thing to, and then we could couple that with practicing like experiencing and learning about delays. And the two together might be a really good way to go, I think.
Interesting. It's almost like self-talk when you're listening to yourself.
Yeah.
So one of the things that one of the models of addiction and impulsivity and things like that I've heard of is that some of these dietary choices could be affecting the gut microbiome, and that may be releasing neurotransmitters and things that may be impacting how people behave. What are your thoughts on that? how much of an impact do you think that has?
I'm certain we're changing their microbiomes with when we give them the foods that we give them. And I mean, the gut-brain axis is obviously becoming very popular because there's recognition that I think with serotonin, I can't remember what, it's a pretty high percentage of serotonin where the precursors like rely on things in your gut. So I think without a doubt, it's a little far afield for me, but
sure.
I would think the microbiome is pretty key as well.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating aspect of it. I saw also in your publications list that you have looked at a little bit of the social factors that may be influencing some of this stuff too. I'm fascinated by the rat park stories from several decades ago. I think it was Bruce Alexander, right, who started all of that. Are you doing something similar like that, and then and looking at how it impacts impulsivity? So maybe you could start from that idea and talk about what you're doing.
Yeah. So there's so this really relates to enrichment, and it's pretty well established that individuals who live in more enriched environments, have a lot of, better self-control, better coping skills, the kind of things that we see with the kids who can, if you will, pass the marshmallow test.
Enriched and what? What do you mean by enriched?
Well, in terms of people, this would be like having a lot of opportunities to like learn and advance yourself, like after school programs.
Experiential.
Experiential kind of, environments. And then also having, a warm house to go home to and healthy food to eat. In rats, they stimulate enriched environments by giving them both social enrichment and also you can give them novelty enrichment. The novelty enrichment kind of stimulates the opportunity for experience. So you literally give them toys and then they can interact with the toys and kind of get this novelty enrichment effect. We have done some work with both the social and novelty. We found that social enrichment promotes self-control. So even just having one other rat with them, just having a buddy was actually enough to significantly promote self-control. We actually found that giving them toys partially reversed that effect. So now they were getting a new toy every day. So they were kind of like the spoiled rich kids, if you will. Maybe having like less frequent changes in toys maybe would be better. But we were kind of like almost over enriching them with the toys. And that actually kind of backfired a little bit, which was interesting.
So if we start to scale some of these findings globally, right, or at least in the United States, where we're seeing an increase in some people say an increase in impulsivity within the general population, but certainly obesity issues and things like that. How does that translate? Do you think that the fact that more people are looking for meaning, or maybe feeling more lonely, and the social isolation and all that are having an influence on obesity in the United States, and that's sort of part of the explanation?
I think that certainly could be possible. I think there are probably a lot of variables driving that. I know I've seen things as well about the kind of new, more like social media culture where people don't actually interact physically with each other. So you may have a lot of online friends, but if you don't actually have like face-to-face time, that actually seems to be related to a lot of problems with like anxiety and depression. It suggests that maybe we actually need physical contact with people to really like get the effects of the social enrichment.
But we don't really know sort of what kind of social enrichment might help with impulsivity. Is that
too
detailed?
I don't think it really know a lot about that, but I think certainly like having some form of physical contact, seems to be a good thing.
So was this what you're talking about, the same sort of thing about drug addiction? I remember reading some rat studies, right, about sort of the social network really
it
reduced,
does. It
right?
really helps.
Yeah.
And of course, impulsivity and addiction are strongly interrelated. So I think they're probably affecting the same systems.
Interesting. So can I go back and ask about sugar? Sure. Because we were talking about fat, and it was fat that you sort of labeled as, or the saturated. So also we should distinguish, so it's not all fat, because you were looking particularly at these processed fats, right? But then sort of one of the things that's happened in nutrition is that people have realized that, the fat was the bogeyman for a long time, right? And geez, it's not nearly so bad, right? And certainly not all fats, right? But sugar's perhaps much worse for like a lot of health effects, right? So So you're looking at both of these, and you saw particularly the processed fats seem to have a longer term effect. Is that sort of, I don't know, how does that line up with sort of this shift in understanding recently about the health effects of sugar versus fat?
Yeah, well, I would just say, I mean, the sugar did produce effects.
Right.
It just was that they rebounded. They kind of looked okay after they stopped eating the sugar. That suggests to me that maybe the effects of the sugar are really quite qualitatively different from the fats. And we know that sugar is addictive and that it actually getting exposed to sugar alters your reward system in a very similar way actually to taking drugs. And it may be that if you just go off sugar that you're able to then like restore your normal reward system functioning again. So I think that's why we probably don't see the pervasive effects.
But if you're on sugar,
if you're on sugar, it's a bad thing when you're on sugar, without a doubt. Sugar is definitely associated with a whole host of other health problems as well. So yeah, I wasn't trying to just make fat out to be the bad guy. I think sugar is pretty bad as well.
What does sugar do to the reward system?
Well, it seems to like dampen your dopamine response so that you actually kind of need to eat more sugar, for example, to feel the same positive reaction, hedonic reaction that you would feel when you maybe used to eat less sugar, much like you see with drug use.
So if you have a couple M&Ms one time, then the next time to get the same high as you need to eat 3 M&Ms and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, more or less. I think it does really, it drives people to want to eat more of it. Yeah.
And in fact, but we ought to specify here that I think we're limiting pretty much to sucrose as opposed to glucose.
Yes. Yeah.
So sucrose, M&Ms, glucose, popcorn.
Yeah.
Sure. So okay. So what's going on there? What's the difference and why?
Well, they're different sugars. They're different structures. They're processed differently in the body.
Well, sucrose is one glucose, one fructose, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Glucose comes in a variety of polymer sizes and complexities, and it's processed very, very differently.
So its impact on the brain and body could be different that's causing that sort of thing.
Oh,
right?
certainly. Yeah.
Another thing that I saw that you were getting into is you've started studying female rats for some of these studies too, because typically it's a male rat that's used, right? Are you seeing differences in sex and in gender, how that's making a difference in some of these results?
We've found a little bit of an effect of gender on our results again, and this is all in rats. But basically 2 things. One is that females, actually, just regardless of whether you give any kind of intervention or anything, seem to be more self-controlled than males in their choice behavior. But in terms of looking at the efficacy of our interventions, we actually found that females were more variable in more individual differences in their reaction to our interventions. But overall, there was no sex difference in efficacy of the intervention. So that was kind of promising because it suggests that you could deliver an intervention to females and it would be just as effective as it was in males.
Could you say something about why it's only been male rats for so long that have been used and not so much female rats? Like this is true in general, right, of the field, yeah.
The issues really has to do with Estrus Cycle. So those poor girl rats, they go through estrus every 3 to 5 days. And I think that's maybe why their behavior is more variable, is because their hormonal environment is just turning over so frequently. I think the traditional way of kind of dealing with that is people either would measure their estrus and account for it, or they would ovarioectomize them. So that's where you remove the ovaries and then that stops them from cycling. But that's not really ideal to do because then you've now got a group of rats that had a surgery and then your males didn't. And so that's not really good either. And so I think it's just mainly because people felt like they needed to control for estrus, but then it's really hard to do. Of course, we don't do that in people, right? So in that sense, like from a translational standpoint, in our work, we just let the females be, and we're like, they're just going to do what they do. We also just recently developed a modeling technique to account for estrus in our data. We do a lot of regression analyses, and we actually just added a sine wave component in. to our regression, and we actually found we detected an estrus cycle in our choice behavior that was there in the females, and we also checked for males. There was no estrus cycle in our male rats, so we think that maybe we can just account for it statistically moving forward.
Interesting. And so that's specifically about impulsivity, the same choice function. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Interesting.
You're really addressing a lot of different aspects of it. This seems to be very, very productive and very broad based. What's the next question you want to ask?
Yeah, well, I've got a few things in the works right now. One is we actually are very interested in trying to delve into the dietary research more. We want to try to get a little bit more at like the brain mechanisms of particularly the high-fat diets. We're also wanting to use our interventions and see if we could rescue some of the effects of the diet on choice. And then we also have some ideas about using omega-3s to possibly rescue the brain effects, because omega-3s are really wonderfully anti-inflammatory. So we might be able to kind of do some of that rescue of the effects of the diet on the brain. And then we've got some other things in the works. I'm actually working on a collaborative venture where we're wanting to do some genotype analysis of our rats to see if we can identify genes that might predict individual differences as well. So, and then we'll probably still keep working on our interventions. We want to start delving a little bit more into some of the brain mechanisms of those.
But you're looking at the same background population. They're all Sprague doolies.
Yeah.
Same type of rat.
If you start looking for doing genetic analysis, do you sort of start looking at different groups of different populations of rats, then different types, or like, and how many? Actually, I don't know anything about this. Is there there are a whole bunch of different kind of rats you can get for these kinds of studies? Or
we weren't planning to go there because to do proper gene analysis, you need about 1,000 animals. And it's pretty laborious to do these tests on them to figure out their impulsive choice. We probably would only start with one, to stay with our Sprague dollies. But you could ultimately do that if you had the resources to do those kind of testing.
So I know this is far afield of what you do, but sort of what's the difference in all these different rats? I mean, so this is like this back to the replication crisis is one of these kinds of things we sort of and you talked about the difference between sort of trying to get very specific in control and power, right? You know, there's this other thing that's sort of control for as many variables as possible, but then that restricts your ability to then generalize, right? You know, so what are the factors there in choosing your model organism when you do all these studies?
So there's the outbred versus inbred difference, which is a really big one. So outbred animals are ones where you breed them with individuals from other lines so that the genetic stock is always varying. And there are different strains that have different original source animals, and then they, continue breeding from there. And then the inbred is where you, of course, breed within a line. And they will oftentimes do that to create animals for specific models.
Yeah, homozygosity increases.
Mm-hmm. And so there's, we have done some stuff with strains that were inbred, that were developed for specific functions. Turns out these one rats are called spontaneously hypertensive rats. They were bred specifically to be a hypertension model, but it turns out they're really hyperactive and impulsive. It was just a kind of accident,
right. Yeah.
So, they have special animals they bred for obesity research. And then of course you can also do, genetic knockouts and create special models as well.
Across all of these rat models that are out there, what's the rate at which they transfer to human applicability, right? There's a big issue in pharmacology that, they see effects in rat models, but then when they try to use them in human populations, they're not able to really see anything, right?
Yeah.
How well does that transfer? Just at a guess.
I think that it depends a little bit on your question. So I think if you're dealing with things where the behaviors you're looking at are likely to be very kind of high cortical type functions, you're probably not going to get as good a transfer because rats have a pretty underdeveloped cortex. But for more kind of lower level stuff where you're dealing with reward system, for example, a lot of that seems to transfer pretty well. Our decision-making work that we do, I think we're dealing with fairly low level processes. So I think there has been good translation there. But it's always a challenge in terms of the translation issues. And I think you just have to try and see if it works or not.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you have to do the basic research.
You
to
do the
then
basic
move
research,
out from there,
and then
right?
see.
Do you moving to a larger scale, because this is global food systems and things like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any ideas about like governmental policy or school lunch policy or anything like that you would like to see to help with obesity issues in children and that sort of thing? What are your thoughts on that arena?
Well, one of the things that I've really been thinking about quite a lot with children is that children oftentimes don't really have choice about their diet. And so they may be getting exposed to foods that could then, set up a pattern where if they're really impulsive because they ate a lot of bad foods when they were younger, they then could be set up to a lifetime of impulsivity and unhealthy eating. So I think it is really essential that in cases where, we're determining the diet of the kids, that we really make sure that they're eating foods that are good, not just for their bodies, but for their brains as well. So I think that's a really essential one in terms of policy.
So like making sure that the school lunches and things have the right composition and that sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's something we don't often hear enough about, probably.
Yeah, and I mean, you could give a healthy food. I mean, something that seems like a well-balanced diet, like maybe you give them some lasagna, but if you use a saturated processed fat when you made it, there could actually be problems lurking in there that are going to have a negative impact. So thinking about the ingredients of food as well, rather than just the end product of the food.
So can I ask about effect size? Because this is something we started with, right? So of all the other factors that sort of might affect impulsivity, right? Sort of, a variety of things. You're talking about SES, socioeconomic status, and sort of all these other things that sort of affect us, right? So how big is the dietary effect compared to these others, just with respect to this impulsivity issue?
Certainly in our rats, it's quite large.
It's pretty big, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But you're not looking at a lot of other variables there either. That's kind of the
No.
point. They're
And when you start
controlled.
putting
It's
in
one strain of
context,
rat, and it's sort of like only a certain environment, right? Yeah.
Yes. I think if you put it in context where there could be other moderators, it's going to be weaker in people than it is in the rats where we have the full control.
Right. So in terms of like non-dietary stuff, right? Sort of the food, sort of the type of food versus like enough food calories, right? Sort of to feed the brain growing and development versus sort of other kinds of factors. What's your main and actually sort of even with food, like having choice, like learning how to make your choices. That's one of the things that you talked about. Sort of what other kinds of recommendations do you, I mean, it's hard to translate basic research into recommendations, right? Sort of, but what other things are you concerned about, sort of about, especially raising kids?
I think another thing that I've thought a lot about is that we are a very instant gratification society. I sort of think back to, when I first used email and how long it took to boot up your computer and get your email open. And now if it took that long, I would be going crazy. Like, what's wrong? Like, why is it taking so long? I think there is value in making kids wait for things and kind of not just automatically fulfilling that instant gratification. And that could be a way that really self-control can be just built into upbringing if you don't just automatically always, go for the fastest option. I don't know. I think it's good to be bored a little once in a while.
It's
Promotes creativity, right?
Yes, it does. Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on and this is sort of kind of out in left field, but do you have any thoughts about how things like bad food are advertised and the impacts that might have psychologically on these sorts of things?
It's really interesting. The advertising is fascinating because it turns out that we form associations between food labels and the foods themselves. So that McDonald's Arches elicits the same response as actually a hamburger in our brains, which is really fascinating. And I think in terms of that, I mean, the labeling is actually, it's eliciting desire to want to eat the food. So I think being mindful about those associations, I think is probably definitely important. Another issue, and this again is going pretty far afield for me, but I know that, in the cereal aisle, for example, they put the foods at the level the kids'
high
eye
sugar
that have
foods
the
that
high
are
sugar
right,
in them.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, we know that with decision making, that things like that actually really do influence your decisions. If the food that you first see is the one that you're most likely to pick. So maybe also trying to combat some of those factors would be a good thing.
Yeah, and this is one of these like really basic things that's sort of been behind a lot of what you do and you talk about, but sort of it's hard for, I mean, even when you know a lot about it, it's hard to think about yourself as, the processing, the thinking we do, so much of it's automatic, so much it is controlled by other things, right? And we like to think we're in control of things, but you just, all right, so if you feed me different food, apparently I'm behaving differently, right? So how should we, be thinking about our own selves psychologically in general like this? Are there major shifts in terms of how to think about yourself that you would recommend to people?
That's really interesting. I mean, I think sometimes we give ourselves too much credit for being like this really advanced species. When, I think a lot of like what we do is still very much driven by maybe our animal past, if you will. I think being very aware of the importance of habits is a really important one, and that establishing habits can actually go a long way towards you being able to change your behavior. That's much more effective to establish a habit than to try to like just consciously
to decide at the moment.
We have
right?
to decide to do a
to
habit,
do the habit
and to keep with it, but it actually only takes about 2 weeks of just daily practice of a habit before it becomes pretty automatic. So if people can just like use their system 2s for long enough to get the habit established, then that habit will just kind of take over.
2-part question. When you test the rats, do you test individuals? Is it like one rat in the box being tested?
Yes.
Would you predict or hypothesize that might change if there were multiple rats? And what I'm getting to is the idea of people eating by themselves versus having a meal with others.
Yeah.
Whether that would change the...
That's really interesting. I mean, I'm sure that there's social effects. We know that actually, much like in people, the rats actually engage in social learning about what to eat. So they actually will smell each other's breath. And if they smell a certain food type on a rat that's looking really healthy, they're actually much more likely to eat that food themselves. So I think certainly food choice would be influenced by other individuals.
That's fascinating.
Interesting.
Well, we want to be respectful of your time. We really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us, Scott. John, do you have any further questions?
No, this has been great.
Is there anything else we haven't covered that you would like to say?
We covered a lot. So, yeah.
Fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah. I hope everybody enjoyed. Thanks so much, Dr. Kirkpatrick.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
If you have any questions or comments you'd like to share, drop us an email or check out our website at kstate.edu/research/global food. Something to Chew On is produced by the Office of Research Development at Kansas State University.